What's good? It's Wood. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. We have Terence Crawford, 38 wins and 0 losses, defending his WBO welterweight title against David Avanesyan. 29 wins, 3 losses, and 1 draw. When I was approaching this fight and fight preview, I was kind of thinking, do I want to get right into the matchup in a fight where nobody really thinks David Avanesyan has a chance against Terence Crawford? I mean, it would be one of the biggest upsets in recent memory, right? Like, we look at Terence Crawford as being like a top 2, top 3 pound for pound fighter in the sport. Some people have him at 2, some have him at 3, some have him at 1, but he's that respected across fight fans in general. So I was thinking, do we get right into the matchup, Crawford versus Avanesyan, or do we address some of the politics in Crawford versus Spence or Spence versus Crawford and how Crawford versus Avanesyan kind of gets into the way of that, at least for now? And I was thinking, let's just get the politics out of the way first really quickly. So Spence versus Crawford is about as good a fight as you could make in boxing in any division, right? And we've been wanting this one for a while. There are people who think that, oh, Crawford's ducking. There are people who think that Spence is ducking. I tend to think that neither one of those guys are trying to avoid the other guy. I just think that both of these warriors are built way too tough, have earned too much of my respect for me to think that they are somehow scared of fighting the other one. I just don't buy into it. I think that there are business reasons why it hasn't happened yet. In fact, you could go back and look at different Errol Spence interviews in the past where he says, I want to clean up all of the belts on the PBC side and then make the cross-promotional. Well, then cross-promotional fight with Terence Crawford when Terence Crawford was on Top Rank fighting on ESPN. He made it clear he wanted to clean up his side of the street. Well, a detached retina and a car accident where he got flung from his speeding Ferrari, those were obviously setbacks in Errol Spence's career. But what did he do? He did collect that second belt, the WBC belt from Sean Porter, and then eventually got around to fighting Ugas after Ugas beat Pacquiao and collected the WBA belt from Ugas. So this fight was going to take some time to make as it stood. But it just seemed like after Terence Crawford handled business about a year ago, stopping Sean Porter, becoming the first and only guy to stop Sean Porter, and then you had Errol Spence earlier this year, not only beating Yordenis Ugas, but stopping Ugas. It just seemed like, okay, now is finally the time where this fight has to get made. So then they entered the negotiations, and it wasn't without obstacle. I mean, there were a lot of things that had to be addressed. It was a long, drawn-out process. You know, we got reports even from the Michael Bensons and Mike Coppinger specifically that terms were agreed to, and then it turned out that, you know, Crawford wanted more transparency from the PBC side since there was no guarantee. It just started to drag out, and now it hit a point where it looks like Crawford was presented with an offer that included, what, $10 million guaranteed, reportedly? Well, if they being BLK Prime, the promoter of this event, are the ones who are paying Terence Crawford this money, and they are a platform. They're a streaming platform that I think, the way I see it, like Triller, they're trying to make this a part of their portfolio to gain more notoriety to then facilitate their core business. I don't want to get too much into that, but if they are really giving Terence Crawford that much money to fight David Avanesyan right now, you know, I can't really fault Terence Crawford for taking that. As disappointing as I am as a fan, and I'm sure you are as boxing fans as well, I can't begrudge somebody for making basically, possibly, more money than they have made at any stage of their career up to this point. If this is the biggest paycheck that he's getting, then I cannot fault him for getting it. It does suck for everybody who desperately wants to see Errol Spence versus Terence Crawford. And I do think that, you know, PBC and Errol Spence were kind of blindsided with this one. I think that they were, you know, negotiating, kind of playing hardball, but I think that things were slowly starting to materialize. I don't know whether or not they ended up showing Terence Crawford the transparency that he wanted to see. I don't know whether they delivered on that. I just hope that they come back to the table. If Terence Crawford gets by David Avanesyan, I hope that they come back to the table, and I hope that both parties continue to negotiate in good faith. That's what I really want to see. And I just hope that there is nothing mandated from the sanctioning bodies on the Errol Spence side that will force him to have to defend his belt against like a Keith Thurman. I think that, the WBC, I believe, had approved Errol Spence versus Keith Thurman, but I don't know whether they are forcing it to where it's ordered in a way where Errol Spence will have to relinquish, one of his belts, one or more of his belts. If he does, just kind of sit back, not take an interim fight. Like, Terence Crawford is taking this fight with David Avanesyan. I wouldn't be opposed to Errol Spence just sitting back and saying, okay, handle your business. Let's get back to the negotiations after that, and let's get this fight done. I kind of hope that that's what happens, because if Errol Spence is to schedule something with like a Keith Thurman, well, that's going to be a few months from now, at least a couple of months from now, right? So we would have Terence Crawford fighting Avanesyan in December. We would then have Spence fighting, say, Keith Thurman in like March. That just pushes the date out even more. And as it stands, Terence Crawford is already 35 years old. He's going to turn 36, I believe, like in September. So do we really want to flirt with a nearly 36-year-old Terence Crawford fighting Errol Spence Jr.? I'm just seeing that the window of this fight taking place when both guys are definitely going to be in their prime, it's almost past that expiration date. And that is so unfortunate. Like, if you look at, great welterweights of the past, when they were 35, almost 36 years old, and I'm just suspecting that Terence Crawford might be nearly 36, if not 36, by the time Errol Spence and Crawford gets made. When Sugar Ray Leonard was 35 going on 36, he was losing to Terry Norris in the second to last fight of his career. After losing to Terry Norris, he was gone for 6 years, came back and lost to Hector Camacho. That's where Sugar Ray was at 35 going on 36. At 35 going on 36, Felix Trinidad was fighting the last fight of his career against Roy Jones Jr., like up at like light heavyweight or something. Oscar De La Hoya was fighting the last fight of his career against Manny Pacquiao at nearly 36 years old. Thomas the Hitman Hearns was fighting at like between light heavyweight and cruiserweight by the time he was 35, 36. Floyd Mayweather, yes, he was beating Canelo Alvarez at 36 years old, but him, like Manny Pacquiao, those are the outliers. I think Manny Pacquiao at that point was, fighting Chris Algieri and about to fight Floyd Mayweather when Pacquiao was 36. So Floyd and Manny Pacquiao, those are like such outliers. But it's like, do you really want to flirt with this being the portion of your career that you're going to step into the ring against a, still prime, to me appears to still be prime, Errol Spence Jr.? We're just playing with fire. I just hope that after Terence Crawford versus Avanesyan, assuming Terence Crawford gets out of this fight with the win and doesn't like injure his hand or sustain a bad cut or something like that, that's what we're playing with at this point. So let's get into Terence Crawford versus David Avanesyan. We already know that Terence Crawford was a former belt holder at 135, former undisputed champion at 140, has been a long-time WBO champion at 147, and, he was somewhat a knockout artist at 140, 135, especially towards the end of his reign at 140, collecting all of the belts there. But since he's become a welterweight, he is now 6-0. with 6 knockouts. All of his fights at 147 have ended via knockout. And yes, it did start a little bit lighter with, Jeff Horn, which, that was his debut at the weight class. Jeff Horn, at a point, was a pretty respected fighter, especially around the time that he had beaten, controversially, via decision, but beaten Manny Pacquiao. No, he wasn't looked at as being the best in the division, but damn, as a debut in the division for Terence Crawford, I didn't hate that matchup, and he stopped Jeff Horn, stopped Jose Benavidez Jr., stopped Amir Khan, stopped Mean Machine Kavaliauskas. That fight is actually worth a rewatch, because Crawford got hurt a couple times early. It ended up being a bit of a firefight. He ended up stopping Mean Machine Kavaliauskas in the 9th round, and then he fought Kell Brook, where he was, kind of arguably losing the first 2 rounds, switched to southpaw, as he often does, switched to southpaw in the 3rd round, caught Kell Brook with the lead right hand from a southpaw stance that just shook up Kell Brook's equilibrium, had him crashing into the ropes and basically never recovered, took a few more punches, and that was it. And then in what might have been the performance or the most meaningful stoppage win of his career, that stoppage win over Sean Porter, that is Terence Crawford's most recent fight. But now that fight against Sean Porter was like a year ago, so now he's going to be fighting David Avanesyan, who I first remember beating an an old Shane Mosley in what turned out to be the last fight of Sugar Shane Mosley's career. Illustrious Hall of Fame career, but yeah, it ended with a decision loss to David Avanesyan. And then a few fights later, I remember Avanesyan fighting Lamont Peterson, where Lamont Peterson just totally walked David Avanesyan down, just put a beating on him, like just kept on coming forward. And David Avanesyan, if nothing, is like a very hard puncher, comes in with some pretty fast ambushes. He's a shorter fighter for the division, but he throws hard straight punches and hard looping hooks. Like he really mixes up his attack. But Lamont Peterson was really having none of it and felt comfortable, again, just walking Avanesyan down. That was back in 2017. So that kind of gave me like a ceiling for Avanesyan. It's like, okay, if Lamont Peterson was able to do that with you, it puts a limit to how good I think you, Avanesyan, are. And then 2 fights later, he got stopped by Mean Machine Kavaliauskas in the 6th round of a 10-round fight. Mean Machine also has blistering power. So that was kind of like a bona fide firefight between hard-hitting Avanesyan, hard-hitting Mean Machine. Something had to give there. Again, Mean Machine ended up winning via TKO. But since that point, Avanesyan has kind of had a resurgence where he has won like his last like 6 or 7 fights, all by knockout. And in many of these fights, Avanesyan has kind of proven to be somebody who you can't quite count out. Like if you look at his betting odds in a lot of his fights, when he fought Kermin Leharaga in back-to-back fights, Avanesyan was the betting underdog, big underdog against Leharaga. He was a big underdog against Mean Machine. And again, Mean Machine did, in fact, win that one. But he was also a big underdog against Josh Kelly. And that was like the 3rd time they tried to make that fight between the hot prospect, who was showing a lot of flashiness, kind of does the Philly shell thing, and is kind of like a slick fighter who looks very athletic in the way that he throws his punches. So Josh Kelly was favored to beat Avanesyan. And that's a fight worth rewatching as well, because in the early rounds, Josh Kelly was having a ton of success against Avanesyan, outboxing him, just beating him to the punch, counter-punching effectively, making Avanesyan look like he was just kind of lunging forward clumsily and then getting countered as he was coming in. Something to keep in mind when you're fighting somebody as dangerous and as calculated and as adaptable as Terence Crawford, who appears to watch and see everything and then can make you pay based on what you might not even know your vulnerability is. And he makes him pay in the worst way. I would argue he makes him pay worse than Errol Spence makes him pay at any given moment with the right uppercut, with the right counter. Terence Crawford is about as devastating as they come. So Avanesyan was kind of coming in against Josh Kelly, getting counterpunched effectively. But then during one of the ambushes from Avanesyan, it looked like his elbow scraped against Josh Kelly's head, cutting like the back or like the side back of his head. And he was bleeding profusely. It didn't seem to bother him too much in his performance. He was still boxing effectively over the next couple of rounds, even as blood was just coming down his entire body, bleeding all over Avanesyan as well. Josh Kelly was still doing pretty well round over round. But by the 4th round, you could see Avanesyan was starting to get to him. And then there was a clash of heads where, again, Avanesyan, who does tend to put his head down a bit as he's coming forward with some of those lunging shots. And I just hope that there's not a clash of heads between Terence Crawford and David Avanesyan, because David Avanesyan can get very gritty and kind of, I don't want to use the word dirty, but he can make it a rough fight. And if you're coming in with the head, it just leads to damaging encounters. And I just hope that that doesn't happen with Terence Crawford versus Avanesyan. But it did in Josh Kelly versus Avanesyan. And Josh Kelly suffered a bad cut. And unlike that cut gash to the back of his head that was bleeding profusely, the cut over the eye did seem to visibly bother Josh Kelly. He didn't seem to be the same after that. He kind of looked like he might have panicked a little bit. And yes, I mean, he was breathing heavy going back to his corner after like the 5th round. And then Avanesyan seemed like he was like heating up. And look, I don't know whether it was more because of the cuts and the loss of blood and the gashes to Josh Kelly that really swung the tide. It seemed that way to me. I mean, it might have just been Avanesyan, coming forward and sustaining the pressure, whereas Josh Kelly started to get tired. Maybe that was the case. But those cuts, especially the cut over the eye, seemed to me to play a large role in Josh Kelly getting stopped by David Avanesyan in the 6th round. So that was probably Avanesyan's most impressive stoppage in this recent run that he's been on. Yes, those back-to-back wins over a then good prospect from Spain, Lejaraga. Again, Lejaraga was a favorite over Avanesyan. Those were impressive as well. So Avanesyan has been surging as of late. But let's look at Terence Crawford versus Avanesyan. I think that Avanesyan's style just feeds right into Terence Crawford's skill set. Yes, I do think Avanesyan is going to catch Crawford cleanly. Crawford does get caught. We saw him get caught and hurt and kind of wobbled against a very fast-handed former featherweight champion, Yorkis Gamboa. We've seen Terence Crawford, I remember him getting raked to the body and kind of hurt to the body, even against Jose Benavidez Jr. And he did get outboxed in spurts against Kell Brook. And Sean Porter was very competitive until those last couple of rounds before getting stopped. Sean Porter was arguably winning more rounds than he was losing against Terence Crawford. So he's not like a perfect fighter by any stretch. I've seen him lose rounds in several different fights. But the adjustments that he makes, he just seems to take control over it by the middle rounds. And again, he is so unforgiving. Once he does have you figured out, you're about to get hit. You're about to get hit by something that you didn't see coming, and it's going to be a hard shot. It's probably going to put you on your butt, if not your back. And David Avanesyan, he's going to hit Crawford. I do think that he's going to hit him a few times with some looping, maybe some quick wide hooks, maybe even coming up the middle with his 1-2s, fast 1-2s. I suspect Terence Crawford might, as he often does, start the fight from an orthodox standpoint, but I think he will switch it up at some point as well. And I just think that the head over skis approach of David Avanesyan is going to get him hurt against Terence Crawford, probably sometime between like the 4th and 7th round. I do think that we're going to get more fireworks here between Crawford and Avanesyan than we would if Avanesyan was to, say, fight Errol Spence Jr. Like, I think Errol Spence Jr. can tame and control Avanesyan better than Crawford can. Like, I think that Errol Spence would be winning just about every round and then stop Avanesyan. I think Avanesyan might have some better moments against Terence Crawford, but I think that once the proverbial switch is flipped by Terence Crawford, that it's going to result in a more dramatic looking knockout. Like, I think Errol Spence could control and then back up Avanesyan, basically do what Lamont Peterson did to Avanesyan. I can't get that fight out of my head for Avanesyan. Him getting walked down and beaten down by Lamont Peterson. Because I'm thinking if Lamont Peterson could do that to you, imagine what a Errol Spence or Terence Crawford would do to you. But I think that they would do it in very different ways. I think that Errol Spence would control, use his jab, use his reach, and get hit by Avanesyan less. Then I think Terence Crawford will, but I think that Terence Crawford is going to probably more dramatically stop Avanesyan than Errol Spence would. Even though, again, keep in mind, Errol Spence has stopped Yordanis Ugas, Kell Brook, has knocked Leonard Bundu out cold, stopped Chris Algieri. Like, I'm not knocking Errol Spence's ability to finish. I just think that there's more trickiness to Terence Crawford's style, and I think that it just potentially leads to a dramatic knockout of David Avanesyan. So I'm going to go Terence Crawford by, it might even be an early-ish stoppage. Like, when David Avanesyan was in those early rounds against Josh Kelly, he was getting rocked a couple of times, and he was getting outboxed before, again, the gash here, then the cut here, and then the fight swung. David Avanesyan gets hit, and he gets hit pretty cleanly. He gives you so many opportunities because of the way he attacks. Like, the reach advantage is going to be profound between these two. Yes, they are about the same height, but Terence Crawford has a 74-inch reach, 2 inches greater than the Floyd Mayweather or the Errol Spence reach, whereas David Avanesyan has a 69-inch reach. So I just think that, you know, this is going to result in some like sort of an uppercut finish for Terence Crawford. I would say that this fight doesn't make it past, I was going to say the 8th round, but I'm going to take it a step further. I don't think that David Avanesyan gets out of the 6th round against Terence Crawford. Again, unless Terence Crawford is not nearly as sharp as he used to be, and that cliff could come at any time, I think that we're working with very borrowed time at this point. But I think that Terence Crawford is still good enough to stop David Avanesyan in the middle rounds. I'm going to go with the 5th or 6th, maybe 7th round stoppage for Terence Crawford. But yeah, let me know what you think about Crawford versus Avanesyan. Does Avanesyan have a chance? And if Crawford does handle business here, do you think that they make Spence versus Crawford next? Do you think that Errol Spence will eventually schedule another bout in the meantime? And how much will that further push the potential date of a Errol Spence versus Terence Crawford fight. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Like the video. Subscribe to the channel if you are into the fight talk. I'm Woog. Thanks for tuning in.